Hello and welcome back to the Crime Reel. For this week's true crime narration, we will be taking a look at the life of Samuel Sheinbein, a 17-year-old who brutally murdered the enemy of a childhood friend to practice killing before setting his sights on his true target. This case has many twists and turns, including an extradition battle between the United States and Israel that raged for over a year and strained foreign aid relationships. Eventually, this came to an explosive conclusion in a fatal standoff with prison guards long after Samuel's victim had been laid to rest. Samuel was born on July the 25th, 1980. His father, Sol, was a lawyer. With his wife, Victoria, Sol raised their 3 children in a quiet, upper-middle-class suburb of Montgomery County, Maryland, which was just outside of Washington, D.C. They were a religious family and brought their kids up in the Jewish faith. As a boy, Samuel attended the same Jewish day school his sister had already graduated from. However, unlike his sister, he struggled in school. Samuel's older sister, Natalie, would later say that Samuel wasn't invited to many birthday parties, starting from around the age of 4 or 5. She claimed the neighbourhood parents seemed to sense that there was something wrong with Samuel. As he grew older, friends said that he was exhibiting behaviour similar to schizophrenia, something the family seemed to be completely unaware of. Samuel also developed both anorexia and obsessive-compulsive disorder. From the outside, the family's life appeared to be picture perfect. A quiet neighbourhood, good jobs, nice house, beautiful family, but Samuel had a habit of getting himself into trouble. Classmates at the Charles E. Smith Jewish Day School said Samuel always had an odd fixation on crime. By the 8th and 9th grades, there were already recorded incidents of Samuel breaking into various cars and houses. This behaviour was encouraged further when he met a boy at school named Aaron Needle. Aaron, who would later become Samuel's accomplice, was every bit as troubled as his counterpart. When the 2 boys crossed paths, they walked together on a road that eventually got them both expelled from school. At that point, Aaron's father sent him to multiple youth programs and military-style boot camps in an attempt to reform his behaviour, including the Mark Twain School for Troubled Youth, which has since closed its doors. When that didn't help, 15-year-old Aaron was admitted to hospital under an involuntary psychiatric evaluation. His father stated that Aaron was addicted to alcohol and marijuana, and also that he was a danger to himself. At some point during this time, Aaron even stole the family car, which prompted his father to call the police on his own son. Meanwhile, after his brief stint in a boot camp, things seemed to be looking up for Samuel. As he entered high school, he became a wrestler and seemed to be liked well enough. He had a mean streak and held a grudge, but was a bright student and enjoyed working with his hands. In fact, he was such a good student that he would manage to ace a math test just a day after murdering someone in cold blood. In the months before the crime, Aaron's behaviour seemed to be improving as well. Although he had dropped out of school, he got his GED soon afterward, showing that he had high school level academic skills. He had enrolled in college and he seemed to be doing better, with hopes of becoming a US Marine. Alfredo Tello, known to his friends as Freddy, was a social butterfly and a talented graffiti artist. He had a bright future and dreamed of having his own art studio one day. He had a wide pool of friends and Aaron happened to be included in it. There seemed to be an undercurrent of tension between the two though, and it didn't take long for other people to notice this. Freddy, known for his easygoing nature, often hurled anti-Semitic insults at Aaron, although by many accounts this was mostly to counter the racist comments Aaron made toward Freddy's Latino heritage. This became something of a game to the two, one that Aaron appeared to take way more pleasure in than Freddy did. They spent a lot of time together, but Aaron's increasingly erratic behaviour, specifically with girls, pushed their friendship to breaking point. 1 week before the murder, Freddy finally snapped and punched Aaron in the face in front of a girl that Aaron liked. This effectively ended their friendship. The shame of being punched in front of the object of his affection prompted Aaron to immediately call Samuel, with whom his friendship bordered on a strange obsession. As it turned out, Samuel was also having girl trouble. Samuel had offered another friend $1,000 to lure his crush's boyfriend into a vehicle, or $5,000 to kill him outright. An offer that was refused and quickly laughed off as a joke. At some point in the midst of actively plotting the death of his target, Samuel decided to take matters into his own hands. However, he decided that he needed to practice on someone else first. Aaron just happened to have a potential victim in the form of Freddie Tello, his newly formed enemy, and he seemed happy to help Samuel with the task. Samuel began his preparations by writing what prosecutors would later dub a recipe for murder. On a sheet of notebook paper, he listed all the instruments needed to carry out his horrific plans, including size 14 shoes, despite him and Aaron both wearing size 10s. Next to this particular item was a clear indication of Samuel's intentions to commit the perfect crime, and how to get away with it, perhaps if only on a technicality. There was a poorly spelled note of a quote from the famous line of the O.J. Simpson trial, "If they don't fit, you must acquit." September the 15th, 1997 was moving day for 19-year-old Freddie Tello. As he was unpacking boxes and arranging furniture from his mother's house into his small basement apartment, Aaron and Samuel made 22 phone calls to each other. The next morning, on September the 16th, Samuel and Aaron took a trip to a home improvement store to pick up a trash can, propane cylinders, a torch kit, and a circular saw. They had also purchased 2 pairs of goggles the previous evening. They had all the ingredients for their horrific recipe, and they were ready to set the trap. We can never know what Freddie Tello's last moments were like, but we do know that Samuel and Aaron picked him up from his job on the evening of September the 16th, 1997, and he was never seen alive again. Investigators would later say that Samuel and Aaron incapacitated Freddie with a stun gun before choking, stabbing, and savagely beating him to death with a sawn-off shotgun. A gruesome end to a life that showed much promise. Samuel and Aaron then left Freddie's remains hidden in the Sheinbein family garage for the night and went about their business as usual. The next day, the Sheinbein family noticed an awful smell coming from the garage, but Samuel explained it away by telling his family that a moped battery had exploded. With time running out, Samuel turned his attention to a vacant house nearby that had been put up for sale by a classmate's family. He told this classmate that he wanted a private place to take a girl for a few hours and asked to use the empty garage. The classmate agreed and told him where to find the spare key. Later that same day, Samuel and Aaron were seen digging in the yard of the for sale house. Neighbours also noticed them wheeling a garden cart from Samuel's house to the vacant garage, with a trail of blood droplets following them down the sidewalk. It would seem that despite planning every detail of the murder, the pair had not thought through how they should dispose of the evidence. Freddie's body was discovered the very next morning. On September the 19th, 1997, 2 real estate agents visited the house to get it ready for a showing and noticed a foul smell. They followed the stench to the garage and found what they thought was the charred carcass of a deer wrapped in black trash bags. When the police were called, they determined that the remains in the garage were that of a human torso. The police believed that the killers dismembered Freddie's body with a circular saw to make him easier to move. The limbs were missing and ultimately would never be found. The homeowners were immediately called and the pieces fell into place rapidly after that. The classmate that had provided the key pointed the authorities in Samuel's direction, but when they went to Samuel's house, Samuel was missing. Samuel's family gave the police Aaron Needle's name, and the police went to talk to him next, only to learn that he hadn't come home from school that day. As the hunt for the 2 teenagers began, Samuel and Aaron had fled to New York. Once in New York, they called their parents. Aaron's parents bought him a train ticket and managed to convince him to return to Maryland. After the train journey, he was quickly apprehended while hiding under a blanket in his mother's car. Aaron would hang himself in his jail cell soon after. Meanwhile, Samuel's father, Sol, went to New York to meet with Samuel and provided his son with his passport, a change of clothes, and a ticket to Israel. Sol then drove Samuel to the airport and put him on a plane. Saul's decision to help his son would set into motion a year-long struggle in international courts and lead to an obstruction of justice charge for himself. Because Saul was born in Israel, he was technically considered a citizen, and this afforded certain protections to his son under the so-called law of return, which would not allow the extradition of Israeli citizens to the US. Despite spending his entire life on American soil and the brutal acts he had committed, Samuel was able to successfully apply for citizenship, and as such could not be forced to return to the United States to answer for his crimes. As details of Freddie Tello's senseless death emerged, and of Samuel successfully fleeing the country, outrage began to spread through the community, particularly among the Latino population. Because Samuel was Jewish, he was able to exploit a law originally meant to protect Jewish people in Israel from being unjustly prosecuted by anti-Semitic regimes. It didn't take long for lawmakers in both countries to take notice, and the intense legal tug-of-war that followed put such a heavy strain on diplomacy that Congress even threatened to cut off any foreign aid if Samuel was not returned to the US to stand trial. The people of Israel weren't exactly pleased with Samuel's presence in their country either. Many people worried that it would set a precedent to allow other criminals to seek refuge there to avoid prosecution, even if their ties to citizenship were merely based on a technicality. Initially, the judge presiding over the extradition hearing offered a compromise. Samuel would return to America to stand trial, but if convicted, he would serve his prison sentence in Israel. Samuel readily agreed to this idea, but the prosecutors back in Maryland weren't as keen. In September of 1998, a full year after the murder, the Jerusalem District Court ruled that Samuel could, in fact, be extradited. But when the case was sent to the Israeli Supreme Court for appeal less than 6 months later, the decision was overturned. A request for the Supreme Court to reconsider was then submitted and subsequently rejected. Ultimately, Samuel would never face justice in the American legal system, although the case would reshape Israel's extradition laws to close the loopholes that enabled him to take refuge there in the first place. He did not, however, escape justice entirely. On March the 22nd, 1999, Samuel was charged with murder with intent to kill, the Israeli equivalent of first-degree murder in the United States. The charge carried a lighter sentence, especially since he was a minor at the time. Had he been extradited back to Maryland, he likely would have been given life without parole. Instead, he was expected to face a maximum of 20 years, with the possibility of early release after 14 years. Some legal experts theorized that this was the main reason his father had sent him to Israel. Saul was a lawyer himself and likely would have known that the Israeli Supreme Court would not allow Samuel to be extradited. Additionally, it would be much easier to build a defence if witnesses couldn't be forced to travel to another country to testify. Others, most notably the family's attorney, claimed that Saul merely sent Samuel to stay with family in Israel because he feared that his son would commit suicide if he remained in America. Regardless of the reasoning behind Saul's actions, the outcome would remain the same. In August of 1999, Samuel accepted a plea bargain. By September, he was ready to confess to the murder, although it did little to soften what would turn out to be the most severe sentence ever handed down to a minor in Israel at the time. On October 24th, less than a month after his confession, a 3-judge panel sentenced him to 24 years in prison with eligibility for day and weekend release after just 4 years and the possibility of parole after 16. He was imprisoned in a juvenile detention centre until he turned 18 and then was moved to a maximum security facility where he seemed to be a model prisoner for many years. As long as Samuel displayed good behaviour, and according to prison guards he generally did, he would be permitted weekend furloughs, meaning he was allowed to leave the prison for anywhere from 24 hours to several days at a time. These furloughs were suspended in 2012 after a shiv was found in his cell, but he maintained that another inmate must have planted it there and demanded that a DNA test and a review of the security footage outside his cell be performed. These demands were denied, but his furloughs were eventually reinstated after a battle in court. On February the 6th, 2014, Samuel arranged to buy a gun from a man he had met online. While on furlough that day, he travelled to a city called Ramla to meet the man, stole his weapon and attempted to run away. The man quickly caught up and held Samuel until the police arrived. Samuel was immediately taken back to prison. Just over 2 weeks later, on February the 23rd, Samuel called his attorney to tell her goodbye. Alarmed and fearing that he was suicidal, his attorney called the prison to inform the authorities, but they showed little concern. Roughly 30 minutes later, as Samuel was being transferred to a different cell, he asked to use the toilet. He pulled out a smuggled pistol and shot 3 guards, 2 of which were seriously wounded, and then barricaded himself in the bathroom. During the hour-long standoff that followed, authorities tried to negotiate and talk Samuel down, but he couldn't be reasoned with. A special forces unit dedicated to prison disturbances arrived on the scene with an attack dog in tow. Samuel fired on the unit and was mortally wounded in the ensuing shootout. When the gun smoke cleared, 7 people would be injured and Samuel was dead. He would have been eligible for parole just a year later. Thank you for listening to that interesting case. This crime was suggested by Steph Carlo. He has reminded me many times to cover the case, so cheers for your patience, Steph. I also want to thank all of my regular listeners and subscribers for your amazing continued support. I really do appreciate it. For those of you that don't know, you are always welcome to visit the community page on the channel, as there are regular updates on there. Thanks once again for listening to the Crime Reel. Stay safe. Goodbye. Psst. There was a Law and Order episode back in 2000 that was based on this case. It's called Return.